excited to tell you a little bit about this project, but before I start, I thought I would start with a story. In graduate school, I stumbled into studying these workers called displaced workers, workers who lose their job as a result of a firm or plant closing or a mass layoff. And these workers are particularly interesting to economists because they've lost their job really because of no fault of their own. And so economists study their trajectory. And when you're studying displaced workers, you have a tendency to see figures like the following one, where there's steady earnings for a long period of time, and then the year of displacement, the workers experience this precipitous drop in earnings, and they really never recover. Some figures have more than one line. This is a figure from the seminal paper by Jacobson, Lalonde, and Sullivan, which looks at Pennsylvania in the 1980s. But this is a widespread phenomenon because other researchers have found this in the US from 1980 to 2008, both during expansions, although it's not as bad, as well as during recessions when it's terrible, as well as in other contexts, like in Germany. We talked a lot about Germany this morning. This is true of both men and of women, and also in other countries like Japan. Now, if you look at figures like this, where you see workers experiencing these large, long-lasting earnings losses on average, it's kind of depressing, frankly. But I'm an optimist, and at this time I was reading Second Machine Age and trying to think about the opportunities that AI had for this particular population. And so that's where this project came about, which is we know that some of these workers have potentially experienced huge earnings losses as a result of our societal focus on replicating human capabilities. But can we identify ways to either mitigate or offset some of these issues by harnessing AI to augment human capabilities? We know that a lot of the dataless articles talked a lot about lifelong learning and training. And in order to effectively lifelong learn and train, we require measuring valuable skills and activities and how jobs are changing. And so the insight that we brought to this project was really that information on skills and the direction of change is hiding in plain sight in the form of online job postings. Job postings have a tremendous amount of information. This is rich text on workers and firms in close to real time and preserving variation. Our project is called work2vec, as tipping our hat to the method work2vec, and involves state-of-the-art natural language processing methods applied to job postings. The two projects I'll talk about today are first, valuing skills and activities, and secondly, a little bit on the direction of change. And so the first project is called Using Language Models to Understand Wage Premia. And in this project, we combine the full text of over 1 million job postings from 2019 with recruiter-inputted salaries associated with those postings. We develop a supervised learning model that has a BERT embedding layer that allows us to understand the relationship between words used in a job posting and the salary being offered. What we find is that the language of postings actually explains 83% of the variation in salaries. And so there is a close relationship between what's being asked in job postings and the salary being offered by recruiters. And so I think that that information is extremely potentially valuable to think about retraining both from a skills perspective and an activities perspective. And so what activities does it suggest are valuable? So now I'll show you a figure from the paper that looks at a few selected activities and the valuation associated with those activities and the relationship with salary. So you can see words like manage, evaluate, repair, and educate are all associated with higher salaries, whereas words like clean, plans, and assembles are all associated with negative salaries. These values have an economic magnitude. So for example, the inclusion of the word evaluate is associated with a 0.0002% increase in salary. Now that's not a big change, but it's for a single word in an online job posting. And so potentially thinking about these changes in the context of what people are capable of doing and how to retrain in that direction might be useful. I'll also show you from a technology perspective, we see positive attributions for most technology skills, with the single exception of the Microsoft Office suite. But the skills used for this particular project, cloud, SQL, Python, are all associated with relatively positive values. And these might be skills that we encourage workers to obtain in order to find more lucrative careers. The second project looks at measuring the latent structure of the labor market. This is joint work with Eric, as well as my colleagues Daniel Rock and Sebastian Staffen. The thought here is that the labor market is really a moving target. If somebody loses their job, then 5 years later, the expectations or roles and responsibilities associated with that job might be very different from the ones that they were previously asked for. So can we identify in close to real time the direction of change? The method that we use is we train a variational autoencoder on job postings from 2010 to 2019 and use the factors from the VAE to measure the volume of the convex hull as a measure of the job space. We find at a macro level that the job space is monotonically increasing every year, that there are more varieties of work, and that these new postings are recombinations of previous postings as well as at the frontier, jobs that never existed before. Zooming in a little bit, we can try and identify potentially the occupations that are experiencing the greatest growth in volume, and for this period I've taken 2015 to 2019. And the thought here is that if you were in one of these occupations before, potentially the scope of work has changed pretty substantially over the past few years, leading you to need to acquire additional skills in order to reapply or be competitive for that kind of work. And so the occupations we find are stock clerks and order filers, natural science managers, so those are like R&D directors, separating machine setters, operators, and tenders, public relations specialists, medical and clinical lab techs. So all potentially affected by technology change, but we're still digging deeper into the causes and consequences of these changes. And so overall, we believe that this type of research can inform a lot of decisions about investment in human capital for both workers, firms, and for policymakers. So just a few examples. We talked a lot about upskilling and on-the-job training in today's earlier sessions. We can think about a way in which a firm can write postings with a better sense of the trade-off. So potentially you were looking for a senior person before, but now you know that a junior person can be paid this wage and be invested in for this amount. Workers can make better decisions about investments in themselves. Educators can potentially develop programs to teach such skills. And then policymakers can also support endeavors that we think are worthy with real-time labor market information. So that's just a bit of a taste. I'd love to take some questions and potentially talk about other opportunities with this research.
Here we go. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of how much gain we're getting from using natural language processing for this, as opposed to, okay, can I look and just see, sorry, that, management jobs are going to have, if it's described as management or management skills or something that we should be training people in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a great question. And I think that the best benchmark is government data on, for example, occupation by MSA. This is in the longer version of the slide deck, so apologies. So what you find is that job postings do explain a lot of variation above and beyond census-defined categories. I think that that's one dimension. The other dimension is you can pick these things up in close to real time. And so unfortunately, the Bureau of Labor Statistics only surveys firms and produces estimates on a 3-year rolling average basis. And so you won't necessarily pick up a change that's substantive as fast as you would with online job postings.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions? I liked your last slide, Sarah, where you were talking about how different groups could use your research. And I'm wondering if there's any kinds of, we've got a very varied audience here, if there's any kind of call to action you'd like to issue or a chance to kind of make an ask. I think now could be a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we often talk about training as a solution, but I don't think we've necessarily defined what that means. And so I think trying to be a little bit more explicit about that. We talked about community colleges earlier today. But what are the substantive changes that we as a community believe need to be made in order to allow training to be more accessible to workers?
Great.
Just
Thank you.
A quick
Question in the
on
middle.
my end. Yeah. Sarah, so your paper, the work that you're doing on the structure of the labor market, was there any intuition around why you choose the VAE?
Yeah, so I think that the truth of the matter is that there's more than 800 occupations in the labor market, and oftentimes something like a library assistant and a library technician are characterized as different work, but potentially use a lot of the similar skills. So we were trying to think about a higher dimensional representation of the labor market that still preserved a lot of the interesting characteristics.
All right, let's thank Sarah.